AMD stock just announced their Q2 earnings, and on today's show, we'll go through the revenue. We'll also take a look at the Q3 guidance, compare it to where we are expected to be in Q4. We'll also look at next year as well, the first couple of quarters of 2023, seeing if there's any upside in this stock when it comes to the forward guidance. We'll also look at the financials over at this company. We'll take a look at the revenues, the profits, the cash flows, the balance sheet, get you all up to date with AMD from a financial perspective, and then we'll come over here and look at this from a technical perspective. In the after hours, this stock is trading down by almost 4%. We'll talk about, is this your opportunity to step in there and buy AMD? I tell you what, over the last year, the stock's down just 8.6%, which quite frankly isn't that bad, but you stretch it out to a year-to-date number and you see the full story. Over at AMD, down pretty big this year, down nearly 33%. All of this comes on the heels of those Q2 earnings, which came out just moments ago. Revenue came in at $6.55 billion for AMD. That was 70% year-over-year growth. They also beat on that earnings side, and they beat expectations by a little bit on that revenue side. Expectations were for 69% growth, or $6.53 billion worth of revenue. They came in just fractionally over that. Now, the upcoming quarter, the third quarter, we also got guidance from AMD on that, coming in close to $6.7 billion, plus or minus another $200 million. So it's conceivably as high as $6.9 billion for the upcoming quarter. Now, Wall Street was expecting a number basically right there, actually maybe a little bit over that. So you could say that AMD's guidance of this 6.7 coming in a little bit lighter than what Wall Street anticipated, closer to $6.83 billion. Although if you're bullish AMD, you might think that the extra plus or minus $200 million might turn into a plus. They'll eventually meet these expectations. That is still 58.4% growth if they hit those expectations. Now, we also essentially got full year, an additional Q4 guidance as well, as AMD reaffirmed their $26.3 billion full year guidance, which is essentially Q3 plus the upcoming Q4 as well, plus or minus $300 million there. Consensus was essentially right on that number at $26.18 billion. Again, that's for the full year, but we essentially got confirmation that AMD should be in the ballpark of $6.9 billion worth of revenue for Q4. That would also represent pretty strong growth of 44%. Now, here's your upside with AMD. Is for all of next year, Wall Street is actually expecting this company to shrink down to a mid-teens to low-teens grower for the entire year. So if you're bullish AMD and AMD is able to push back up into maybe the 20, let alone 30 or 40% growth rate for 2023, stock would be wildly undervalued if somehow they're able to pull that off. I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case, but priced into AMD stock is a 2023 where you're quote unquote only growing 14%. Obviously a growth rate in excess of that will probably send AMD stock much higher in 2023. Now, let's jump over here to these earnings. We had that $6.55 billion worth of revenue over at AMD. Last year, just 3.85. Again, this was strong 70% growth. Now, some of this has to do, they made an acquisition this year, and so that's bolted on quite a bit of revenue year over year. Although when you dig into the numbers, there's still plenty of core or legacy AMD business that is growing as well. Cost of sales rose from $2.02 billion up to about $3.1 billion. You also have these amortization of acquisition-related intangibles that came in at $407 million. I'll show you there's some one-time or kind of non-recurring charges in this quarter. Certainly will impact the company's margins, certainly impact the company's profitability. I'll show that to you here in a second. So we got our total cost of sales went from $2 billion up to $3.5 billion. Again, that includes a $400 million, we would assume probably a one-time charge. So your gross profit came in at about $3 billion. Your margins were at 46%. Last year, they were at 48%. My guess is if you add back in this $400 million, you get margins essentially equal to where they were a year ago. Now, big time spending going on over at AMD from $659 on the R&D side all the way up to $1.3 billion. They got something going on over at AMD. I'll tell you what, marketing, general, and administrative accelerated from 341 up to 592. And then finally, you have an amortization of acquisition-related intangibles, another $600 million charge. So in the quarter, you had a $400 million charge related to the Xilinx acquisition and another $600 million. Look, we've got to recognize these costs. I get it. But factor that in when you come down here to operating income coming in at 526, a pretty sharp decline from the 831 that we had last year. But again, we had nearly $1 billion of non-recurring charges. So as you roll through into next year, all things being equal, you should have $1 billion peel off the expense side, and operating income and likely net income over at AMD probably look a little bit better year over year. Certainly a much easier comp to jump over when we get into next year. Now, in terms of the balance sheet, looking really good over at AMD. Beginning of the year, you had $3.5 billion worth of cash. Now you got close to $6 billion. Inventories, we're watching this closely across the board in retail, certainly manufacturing as well. Inventory's ticking up a little bit. Now, it is a little bit interesting though. We are comparing this towards the tail end of December and into the June month. There could be some buildup in terms of the holiday shopping season, also maybe a back to school season as well. Maybe there's also an enterprise upgrade cycle towards the tail half of the end of the year, as well as you get capital expenditures trying to come in the fiscal year to be written off potentially on the next year's taxes. Inventories rising from roughly $2 billion up to about 2.6. That is an increase, but we'd have to almost pull up the June 25th quarter from 2021 and see the difference there. Company bolted on a massive acquisition, and so they have a lot of goodwill. So you notice the total current assets, or the total assets over at AMD, went from 12 all the way up to 67 as they used a mix of cash and stock to get that deal done. We do have some long-term debt on the books as well, coming in at just $2.5 billion. You got another $300 million in this short term. All things being considered, this company has plenty of cash flow and operating profits to cover that type of thing. Now, they don't give us a full view of the cash flows. My guess is if you wait a couple days and wait until the 10Q is filed over at AMD, you'll get a full view of the cash flows. Unfortunately, we only get it in consolidated form, but you should know, if you watch enough of our videos, the operating activities adds back in things like stock-based compensation. So this company, off of $6.5 billion worth of revenue and $3 billion worth of gross profit, was able to squeak out about $526 million worth of operating income. But obviously in R&D, marketing, general, administrative, and my guess is these intangible costs as well are able to add back in from an operating cash flow perspective. And so you have very strong operating cash flows over at AMD, coming in over $1 billion. Last year, they were sitting right about 952. On the investing side, they burned through about 928. We'd assume maybe some of that had to do with the acquisition and those charges that we saw on the operating statement. And then finally, in financing activities, they generated about 114, probably from issuance of debt and potentially AMD stock. Now, you come down here to the segment results over at AMD, you're seeing data center, boom, 813 on the revenue side last year on a quarterly basis, all the way up to 1.5. They are stealing market share from somebody. And look at the operating income as well. That doubled year over year from 200, more than doubled, from 204 up to 472. So you didn't quite double your revenue, but you doubled, more than doubled, your operating profits. You love to see that. If the growth in this data center continues, we should have deeper and bigger operating profits over at AMD, because when you look at the 472 in operating income, it almost beats the client revenues operating income at 677, and it is larger than gaming, which brought in $187 million worth of operating income, and it's also catching up to embedded, which came in at 641. Look at the growth in that business. My guess is they purchased, this is what they got from the Xilinx acquisition. You went from just $54 million worth of revenue in that business. Now you're all the way up to nearly $1.3 billion, and it's very, very profitable. In fact, it's nearly your most profitable business that you run. things look pretty good with AMD. Now, what we have to imagine is we will see some kind of slowdown into 2023. We also saw that inventories over at Intel. We see inventories over here at AMD. We certainly got reads on this as well. When you looked at a Qualcomm, there's enough supply in the system. Certain chips are certainly still backlogged and in short supply, but we are starting to see a normalization of that. We'll certainly see the impact of margins in the future quarters and the future revenues and profits that AMD is able to drive. Now, from a technical perspective, now it got in this downward channel and really went hard and came all the way down to a perfect, I mean, we're talking about a perfect level of support down here at about $75 per share, where this stock bounced almost to the penny, down where it has bounced several times over the last several years over at AMD. We had a large bounce in this stock. It took us all the way from that $75 range all the way back up here to 99, which again was another area of resistance represented by this red line that I have in here. This has been resistance. It's been support in other areas, but it would have took an amazing report from AMD to push through that $99 level. Instead, it has gotten rejected, and now we are seeing AMD stock do exactly what you'd expect from a technical perspective. When you are in this downward channel, and look, this applies to almost any stock that you might have in your portfolio. A lot of stocks have been doing this downward channel, from Microsoft to Apple to Uber. They've all been locked in this downward channel. When they break out like this, we'd actually expect a pullback test to the top of the channel. I'm going to change that to a purple line so you know what the top of the channel is. This purple line represents the top of the channel. When you break out over and above it, and the S&P 500 has done this, Microsoft, several stocks that we're watching right now has done this breakout, we expect a pullback at least to this channel. And you're seeing in the after hours, essentially, that's what you got over at AMD, going from 99 back here to 95. If AMD is able to hold these levels, we should have buying opportunities emerge with AMD right here at about $85 to $90 per share. Certainly you could come and back test all the way back to our area of support down here at 75. It goes without saying that is your buying opportunity. Now, from a very bear case perspective, like an Intel perspective, you could drop out the bottom of 75. You would not want 75 level to break. You could pull up a chart of Intel. What happens when a 2 or 3 year area of support breaks? Well, it's down big, and you're probably going back down to about $50 per share on AMD. However, barring any kind of complete wipeout of the chip demand out there and chip margins, this stock looks poised, in my opinion, to continue to move things right along. The acquisition of Xilinx has brought in a new book of business, and data center appears to continue to grow strong and grow profitably over at AMD. The upside is if this company is able to turn 2023 from kind of a low teens grower from a revenue perspective, if they were able to grow that to a mid to high teens and maybe even as high as 20% growth rate on that revenue side, that would send AMD stock much higher than where it is today. We'll certainly keep an eye on this stock heading into next year. And if you haven't been in this name before, we are essentially on the doorstep, I think, of pretty decent opportunities to buy this on consolidation. Hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video. I'll be back again soon with more. Good luck with your investments.